The Channel Tunnel. Opened in 1994, this is the longest undersea tunnel in the world, running through just over 50 kilometers of chalk under the English Channel. And this is a very important piece of infrastructure. As we all know, this tunnel allows for high-speed trains between London and the continent, but it's also crucial for all kinds of freight and passenger vehicles. With the Channel Tunnel being a literal railway, you'd expect most freight to pass through it on freight trains. But then why are there so many trucks behind me and not very many freight wagons? It's clear that the Channel Tunnel isn't quite meeting expectations when it comes to freight trains. But how is a small height difference ruining cross-channel rail freight? Why are freight operators so scared of Eurostar? What does the Maldmay line have to do with this, and is one of the UK's most powerful locos not powerful enough? Right, let's quickly look at exactly what trains use the Channel Tunnel today. First of all, we have the Le Chelle vehicle trains. These move cars, coaches, vans, motorbikes, and basically any other small vehicles through the tunnel. Yes, coaches aren't small, but anyway. Then we also have the Le Chelle freight trains. These are less complicated than the passenger vehicle trains, basically a giant rolling cage for trucks, and a carriage for all of their drivers. Both Le Chelle trains just run the length of the channel, from Folkestone to Calais. Then of course, we have the Eurostar services. These run from London St Pancras down the entire length of High Speed 1, through the channel, before splitting on the other side, with trains to Paris, and Brussels and Amsterdam. Unlike what you'd expect, there aren't actually very many freight trains that cross the Channel Tunnel. There's only about 4 or so a day, which is much lower than the tunnel's capacity. There's a truck train. The majority of the freight passing through the Channel Tunnel is on trucks, which are on trains, yes, but that's not quite the freight train that we're talking about. The Channel Tunnel is a literal railway, so surely it would be more attractive to run a normal freight train the whole way through, right? So why do only 4 so proper freight trains cross the Channel Tunnel each day, despite there being plenty of capacity in the channel and on the surrounding routes? There's plenty of demand for freight. There's a lot of trucks there. To understand why, we need to first understand the basic types of freight trains. There are 2 main types. We have the trains that carry lots of the same type of freight for a single customer, like big aggregate trains, cars, Tesco meal deals, huge bricks, or any other type of freight that's all owned by one customer and is all going to the same destination. Then there are trains that carry lots of different types of freight owned by many different customers. These are mostly intermodal trains, where each container is going to a different place and is owned by a different customer. These trains will be carrying washing machines, fresh fruit, medicines, electronics, Zuma plushies, and heavy machinery all at the same time. Almost all freight is containerized like this, and freight crossing the channel is no exception. However, of the few freight trains that do cross the channel, all of these are these big load, single customer freight trains. There aren't any container trains. One train carries a bajillion water bottles in special cargo wagons into the UK, one of them carries lots of cars from a car factory into Europe, and there's a couple more like this. But almost all of the container freight travels by road, contributing to delays and congestion on the M20 and M2, which isn't ideal. There's a few reasons why companies prefer to send their containers by road rather than by rail, despite this being more expensive. The first reason is that the UK is a net importer of goods. This means that if you own a container, it's easy to fill it going into the UK, but on the return journey, it's harder to find stuff to put in it. Now, with a truck, it's easier to drive it to a different town or industrial site where there may be an export product, but by rail, it's a lot harder to do this, as rail freight tends to have a few big centralized terminals. However, lots of containers travel back to Europe empty anyway, so this doesn't fully explain the lack of intermodal trains crossing the channel. The problem is the UK's restrictive loading gauge. Yep, the same reason that we don't have double-deck trains. The issue is that over the past few decades, high cube containers and swap bodies have become much more common on the continent. High cubes are the same as any other container, but as the name suggests, they're a little taller. This allows more stuff to be crammed in them, which is quite useful if you own a container.
and swap bodies are lightweight containers designed for land transport only. They are a bit longer than a normal container, ideal for use on trucks, and have a lightweight frame that saves fuel. They can be easily swapped between a truck and a train. But like the high cubes, swap bodies are slightly taller than the average container, and tall swap bodies and containers and low British bridges don't go so well together. It is possible to run these high cube containers on the West Coast Main Line, all the way from London up into the north and Scotland, where a lot of demand is. However, the issue lies in getting these taller containers from the Channel to London, where a lot of northbound container trains start from. But what about High Speed 1, you might be asking? And yes, High Speed 1 is built to a much bigger loading gauge. However, freights only use this at night and quite rarely, for a few reasons. First of all, the obvious reason, High Speed 1 is a high speed line, and freight trains aren't especially fast. Southeastern trains run at 140 miles an hour, and Eurostar trains run at 186 miles an hour. A freight train running at 90 miles an hour with an acceleration of 3 to 5 business days would be very difficult to fit into regular service. However, there were quite a few passing loops built into the high-speed line for this reason though, so again, this doesn't explain everything. High-speed 1 has very steep hills, as lightweight high-speed trains can easily get up them thanks to their speed. However, a heavy freight train would struggle, and even though the 92s are some of the most powerful trains in the UK, they're still limited to only carrying just over 1,000 tons on this line at a time, and that means splitting apart trains when they come out of the Channel, wasting a lot of time. So why not run the 92s in pairs? Good idea, but this messes with the TVM signaling. So until we get ETCS on this line, this isn't possible, and that's not happening for a good 10 years. What about other locos? Well, only the 92s are allowed to run on High Speed 1 and through the Channel, aside from the Class 9s, due to strict safety regulations inside the tunnel. And buying all new locos compliant with the Channel safety regulations is expensive and hard to justify with how little rail freight there is. But the lack of locos contributes to the lack of rail freight and so on. But this isn't the only issue preventing more freight from using the high-speed line. Freight operators are very scared of delaying Eurostar services, which would mean a fine of £880 per minute, which is very expensive. Delaying a southeastern train only comes in at £120 per minute. I'm not too sure why Eurostar trains are so expensive to delay. If you know, let me know in the comments. Something that isn't as expensive as delaying a Eurostar service is becoming a channel member. That way you can help support the channel and get your name on screen right here. We've also got a Discord server, links in the description for that. Anyway, back to the high speed line before we get fined for delaying the video. High speed 1 track access charges are very expensive, as a high speed line requires a lot more maintenance and attention than a normal line, as everything needs to be perfect when you're running trains that fast on it. And heavy freight trains cause a lot more damage to the track than a lighter EMU. A lot of the time this is unaffordable for freight operators, who would rather use the cheaper classic line. Additionally, if freight operators use the classic line, they have a much bigger choice of locos, not just 92s.
And on top of all of that, you can only really get to Barking from the high speed line. But we'll get back to Barking Eurohub in a bit.
So what does the classic line look like? This line runs from Dolan's Moor via Ashford and Maidstone and into London.
There is space to run freight trains on this line too. Since the tunnel was set up, certain paths have been protected on the classic network. But unfortunately, very few of these actually end up getting used. And this is again down to the loading gauge. A lot of the bridges on this line are too low for the high cube containers and swap bodies. Even with special wagons like the lowliners, there is a plan to increase the loading gauge along this route, which involves lowering track beds in a few places where the ballast is quite high, and putting in speed restrictions around low bridges so that wagons aren't bouncing around and hitting things. And all of this is expected to be done by 2029, so no, not exactly very soon.
The issue is, it's hard to get funding when there currently isn't much cross-channel freight to back it up, but the lack of suitable infrastructure is precisely the reason there isn't much cross-channel freight.
He's back.
I'm back, Red. Getlink, the operator of the tunnel, isn't very happy, even with the existing plan. They want the loading gauge to be even bigger, which would allow high cube containers to travel on normal wagons to Wembley in the north, so that freight operators aren't wasting their few low wagons on trains in Europe. This would be quite a bit more expensive though, mostly because it involves modification to the Saltwood Tunnel and modifying platform edges along the whole route. However, Getlink argues that the return on this investment is so large that it's justified, as trade between Britain and Europe would be able to increase significantly. But anyway, that's how to get high cubes and swap bodies to Wembley. But what about Barking Eurohub that we talked about earlier? That's accessible directly from HS1.
Really want to print these out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Become a channel member and you can help buy paper so we can print out the script. Where are we at?
We got to the Barking Eurohub bit.
I already recorded that. Voiceover, me, start talking about barking.
Network Rail has very recently taken it over with the intention of upgrading it to make it more appealing for cross-channel rail freight. Getlink was originally planning on taking it over themselves, but after business rates went way up, they abandoned the project. However, money aside, Barking isn't the solution to everything. Barking Euro Terminal is only accessible via High Speed 1 from the tunnel, which, as we talked about earlier, just isn't ideal for long or heavy freight trains that need to run during the day, which is a big proportion of intermodal rail freight. And freight operators are more interested in getting to Wembley, where a lot of freight trains bound for the north start at. They'd rather swap their wagons there while putting together northbound consists rather than having to do it twice, once at Barking and again at Wembley. Or they'd even like to not have to swap around trains at all and just directly run trains from Europe to the north. And while yeah, it's possible to get high cubes and special wagons from Barking to the West Coast Main Line, this involves using the already very congested Goblin and North London lines, which may not have the paths needed and are quite slow. These definitely need some sort of resignaling, but that's a video for another day. Trains directly from the Channel to Wembley could travel by the South and West London lines, which aren't as busy. And this is why freight operators are so intent on getting their trains directly to or through Wembley. So Barking won't be very useful for northbound freight, mostly just stuff bound for London.
However, a lot of trucks currently drive to London from the Channel. There's something that I haven't seen anyone talking about. On the French side of the Channel Tunnel, which is over there somewhere off camera, who cares, it's France. There are quite a few piggyback trains that run to Calais. Piggyback trains are basically trains that carry the trailers of trucks. These trains usually run to just the French side of the tunnel, then they unload all of the trucks and they drive through the tunnel. Well, not drive through, they go on the truck trains that we've seen a lot of to Folkestone, behind me, then they drive up the M20 to the rest of Britain. But a lot of these trucks are just going to London or the industrial areas in the Thames estuary. What if we were able to bring these piggyback trains from France directly through the Channel, up High Speed 1, and to Barking? Barking is in a really good position to get trucks onto the M25 or directly into the Thames estuary, where there's a lot of industrial activity.
There's an entire pallet of onions in that van, and there's more of... Why are there so many onions?
As these trains are carrying trucks, we don't have to be too fussed about getting them to exactly where they need to go, because they're trucks, they can just drive the last little bit. I don't see why this wouldn't be possible, at least at night when there's fewer high-speed trains. But yeah, bringing the piggyback trains from Calais directly to Barking kinda makes sense, I can't lie. So, yeah, I've run out of things to say. That's all for today. I'll see us next time. Subscribe. Bye.
Will there be a van?
There's a van.
It's back! It's back! The van's back!
One van. Why are you paying truck prices to go on the truck train with your tiny ass van?